Testing 1, 2. Okay, we're good. Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. So we are beginning the workshop. I don't have my paper with me. It's Deepening the Conversation.
We should learn the name of our workshop, shouldn't we?
Yes, we should.
Deepening the conversation inside, reaching the community outside.
Okay, Deepening the Conversation inside, reaching the community outside. So, my name is Alex Weiss. I am the pastor, director of New Worshiping Community, Casas de Paz, Houses of Peace. It's a bilingual church. I would say when we call it a church, it's more out of the model of the house church or micro church, if you want to call it that way, model. And so, but how we got to where we're at, let me give you a little bit of that background and also add in how we also got to becoming affirming. First and foremost, my wife and I, we were born and raised in a very conservative denomination, a Pentecostal denomination. And I was just discussing this with someone. They were telling me right before that they were from an Assembly of God denomination. Well, I said, well, our denomination was actually a split from the Assembly of God because of discrimination. They wanted to become a district, and anyways, that's another story. But they became a denomination because of that. But they kept still a lot of the fundamentalist theology and the closed-mindedness. And so growing up, as you know, in that theology, you saw LGBTQIA as sinful, an abomination. It's a perversion. It's wrong, and so forth. So growing up, this is what I was indoctrinated in. My wife and I, we were indoctrinated in this. So we thought, okay, this is what, pleases God and doesn't please God, right? So as we were indoctrinated in this, our experience started becoming very challenging to our theology because we became friends in school with people that were or are LGBTQIA, and we became good friends. And so it's like, how do you do this? The tension that we had or that I had was, how do I do this? Because I'm looking at my friend here, and according to what I've been indoctrinated in, is my friend's going to hell. Straight to hell. It's like, what do I do? But I love him, and he's a great friend of mine, and I love her, and she's a good friend of mine. So I began a journey, even from then, on how my theology, the doctrine that I was raised in, was not lining up to what love is. Of course, years later, now fast forward, my wife and I, we went to Bible school, we met there, we got married, we became pastors in that same denomination. But in that denomination, we noticed that a lot of it was not lining up to the values that we had of Christ, which is of love, inclusion, and being welcoming and being inclusive. And so, it was so rigid. We were like, we just don't belong here. We just don't fit. So my wife and I, we transitioned out of that denomination. Now, I say this very casually, but you all know these transitions are not easy. Because you're leaving, especially for us, we grew up in that denomination. We're leaving uncles, aunts, friends, people we've known for all our lives. So it wasn't easy for us. But we felt we needed to do that because that was the only way that we were going to be able to align more and more to who we are. But thinking that we were actually going to join something way better, we didn't join something way better. But we transitioned into another denomination, a little bit more moderate, but still non-affirming, and they still up to date are non-affirming, sadly. And that's another story. But with them, we were there for a few years. My wife and I became church planters. We trained under them. And because of discrimination issues, because we focused more on planting an immigrant church, Spanish-speaking immigrant church, the discussions were more on that if what we were doing was ethical, because we were evangelizing undocumented immigrants. And how do you evangelize an illegal person? Well, identities are sacred. People are not illegal. And from then, we started understanding that this isn't our place either. But again, it sounds very casual, But making that transition was not easy for us because there was so much that we did learn, so many relationships we did build there, friendships. A lot of amazing things happened during our time there, but at the same time, there was so many hurtful things that happened. And it was through that pain that we really began to understand if we're going to follow Christ in being inclusive, in being loving, in being accepting, we are going to go through these experiences. We're going to go through loss. We're going to go through pain. We're going to go through, losing people, losing friendships, losing relationships. And we understood, too, that the more we embraced a theology of liberation, the more we stood with those that are marginalized and oppressed, the more we were going to be looked as people that are not following Christ anymore. There was friends of ours that were already calling us apostate just because of that. And right now, if they saw me standing here talking about this and doing a workshop with Brian about this, they really would think I've gone to the deep end. I'm demon-possessed or something because I've lost it. And the contrary, it's so liberating to come to the knowledge of Jesus, the knowledge of his love and his embrace and his acceptance of all, especially those that are marginalized and those that are oppressed. He stands with them, and we should too. And as we went through this process, leaving them, we began our own church. We planted our church 14 years ago here in Sacramento. Mostly Hispanic church, went into bilingual because of, keeping the younger generation. And because of that, then we started getting people that were non-Hispanic in our congregation. It started becoming much more diverse. And it grew to about 400 people, our congregation. And the problem that we were starting to have was we were asking the question, are we truly being inclusive? Because it's like how Brian was saying earlier, the banners of all are welcome here. Is that really true? Are all really welcome in our congregation? Is every marginalized group, does every marginalized group feel safe in this space? Those were the questions that we began to grapple with, to really, really ask. And we started having meetings with our leadership. Both my wife and I, we kept on thinking, hey, I don't think we are fully inclusive. Because I believe that if we're going to stand with people that are marginalized and oppressed, what about LGBTQIA? And that was like the last of the affirming, or the last of the inclusive issues that we needed to face. That we knew we were affirming secretly, but we just hadn't fully come out and really say we are. And I think a lot of people do that because they want to stay safe. They don't want to lose people. Remember, we had hundreds of people, so it's like, man, but if we talk about this stuff and if we really face this stuff, we're going to lose people. We're going to lose donors. We're going to lose money. And we're going to lose people. It was not an easy thing to face. But again, if we're going to live this way, are we going to be true to ourselves? Are we going to be true to who we are? And being inclusive and being affirming and being loving. And so we started having meetings with our leadership, and our leadership, we started talking about what Brian's going to be talking about in a few minutes, of education. How do we educate our congregation? How do we begin these conversations? And said, well, what we could probably do, and we came up with an idea of doing classes, of doing, book studies on this subject. And when we began to do that, it was challenging. But what was so amazing is there was still a good number of people that were on board with us. That even, I want to just briefly tell you a story of one of our dear members that, came out in one of our meetings. She had never, she only spoke to a handful of people that were good friends and family members. But she's like, I had it come out in public. She tells a story, much less want to come out in a church. This is where that's the least safe space. But she said, the fact that you all started these conversations and these classes, And I had no idea she was going to do this, but in the middle of the class, she raised her hand after one of the points that we made that was really strong. She raised her hand and she said, I want to share with you all something, and that only very few people know. And she said it because she felt it was a safe space. She said, I am queer. And it was one of the most amazing experiences we had, because in the room there was so many people that just started to cry. It was very liberating to us. It was liberating to her, but it was liberating to all of us. Now, of course, we had a few people there that weren't in agreement, had a conversation with me at the end. And it was tough to handle some of those situations. But in those transitions, just to let you know, from 400 people, that was one of the main, if not the main issues, but there was many others, but that was a main issue. 400, we went all the way down to 150 people. We lost a lot of people. We lost a lot of people, and we lost a lot of people because we wanted to be inclusive. We wanted to be open. We wanted to be affirming. And there was a big sacrifice for us in doing that. And when we did it, it was difficult, but at the same time, it was satisfying. From those 400 that left, or of the 400 that left, those 150 are people that were solid. People that were with us, people that agreed with us, at least for the most part. But when the pandemic came around, financially we couldn't sustain, we had to close the church down. But not just because of that. We were already seeking ways to transition that congregation. But it wasn't easy because of how we first planted it, with the theology and the foundation that we gave it. So the transition for us was difficult, and it was already a process that we were in for a few years. But God opened a door for us to join PCUSA and become a new worshiping community, so that way we can start all over again, laying the foundation of being affirming. That's why I'm so happy to be a part of these discussions. And I'm thankful and grateful for Brian for allowing me to be able to tell somewhat, or a piece of my story, and just letting you all know that this is what we're all about. This is who we are. And it's beautiful to be able to create these safe spaces. And I believe that as we move forward, I was speaking about this yesterday when we were at the dinner. I said, why did I join PCUSA? Because I see the direction PCUSA is going, and that's the same direction I'm going. And I think that's a beautiful future for us. But I know that it's not easy. And I know very well that it's not easy. And the risks that have to be taken, the courage, the decisions that have to be made, the discussions that have to be made. Throughout the years, it hasn't been easy for us, but I will tell you one thing. People like myself are going to be more attracted to PCUSA as PCUSA moves more and more in that direction. And so, I was telling Brian this. I said, I think in one of the discussions we had, I said, I believe PCUSA has an opportunity to receive many ex-evangelicals like myself. I said, so they gotta be able to hit this one out of the ballpark. So I was telling them, as we were discussing, I was like, well, here I am, swing away. Because I am one of the many, I believe, that are right now, many are leaving the evangelical church, but they're not leaving their faith. They're leaving because they've been hurt, and many of them are LGBTQIA, where they're not safe anymore in these spaces. But I believe that we can together create a safe space for those that are looking for that, for a place that's affirming, that's welcoming, truly welcoming and inclusive. So anyways, that's my story. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, Alex. And Alex I did not let Alex tell his story. Alex and I talked a number of times now about this workshop, and these questions and this way of talking about these issues reflects the work we've done together, and particularly Alex's experience and wisdom from actually walking through this, sometimes at a cost, with a congregation. I want to acknowledge that we are joined in this workshop by our online registrants for the conference. We've offered them one workshop in each time session, and this is the one that they're participating in during this time session. So, and I'm looking at it on YouTube here. This is what it looks like to them. So, hi. We're glad you're here. And if you have questions, I'm going to try to keep an eye on this chat every once in a while, so feel free to pop something into the chat if you'd like. I know, I'm glad. I thought it was best. It also means if any of you speak out, I'm going to probably try to repeat what you say for the sake of the folks who need the microphone. So Alex talked about the process, some of which was internal to his own discernment, he and his wife, as they processed this, some of which they had to work through with a group of congregational leaders, and some of which they had to put out there and let chips fall where they may and have other individuals make choices. All of those things are part of what goes into a process of bringing about transformation, that deepening the conversation within as we prepare to then strengthen our reaching the community outside. What I'm going to talk about are some sort of, I think, practical, kind of down to brass tacks parts of doing both of those things. And the first thing I want to make very clear is that we need to be prepared to talk about both of those things. A lot of times we come to a conversation about inclusion and ministry in the church, and we want to jump right to the second part, the reaching the community outside. And sometimes, and if we never got to that part, that would be a problem. But it's also a problem to jump to the reaching the community part before we've done the groundwork and laid the foundations that goes with deepening the conversation inside. One of the worst tricks we can play on LGBTQIA+ people is to throw a rainbow flag on our building or start using the language of inclusion in an advertisement without having done the work to make sure that the space they find when they get there is actually welcoming. On the other hand, fear of what might happen if we put that rainbow flag out, or use those words, is often used as an excuse for not having the conversation, for not doing that deepening of conversation. And so I want to talk about some intentional ways that we can really pay attention to the conversation, to deepening people's understanding and the things we need to do before we act. So let's start first with preparation for the conversation. I'm speaking mostly of education. The work of preparing to be an inclusive church, to be a welcoming and affirming community, is almost all about education. Now, education takes a lot of forms, like a lot of Christian education in the church. Sometimes you're taking multiple paths all at the same time to bring people all along in their spiritual formation, in their discipleship. There's some things that I think are common threads that run through everything we do. One is that you're going to need, for this kind of discussion, a committed core group of leaders. Now, maybe that group exists in the structures of your church. Maybe you've got a task force. Maybe you've got a social justice committee or something like that. Maybe it's the whole session, but it might not be the whole session that's bought into investing time and energy in this. But you need some folks who are going to be eyes and ears and boots on the ground to say, here's where we are, here's what we need, here's what people are saying, here's the questions they're asking, here's how we're going to try to get some answers. The other thing that I think is really important, and I say this knowing there are some pastors in the room and there are some people here without their pastors, having the buy-in from the spiritual leadership of your congregation, whether that's a pastor or co-pastors or some other arrangement, is absolutely the most helpful thing. It's not 100% essential. It can be done without, but I think it's hard to imagine it working if that pastor is an effective leader but not part of this. And the reason it's hard is that the people are looking for ways to not participate. The folks who are opposed or who are uncomfortable or who are afraid of what might happen if you become a more inclusive church, they are looking for reasons not to engage this discussion. That's a natural human thing to do. And one of the easiest ways for them to not feel like they have to engage is if they're getting signals from the pastoral leadership that this isn't important or isn't central. So I say that as an encouragement to pastors and also to members of congregations. Work to find ways for pastors to engage meaningfully with this conversation. The other word I have for you is and I say this is almost a do as I say, not as I do, because this isn't really my personality, but be patient. We have been oppressing and excluding LGBTQ people in the church for decades, centuries. It might take more than one 4-week Bible study to turn it around in your congregation. Think of what we're doing here as equipping you for a marathon, not a fun run. And with that in mind, that's not an invitation to complacency. It's just a realization that this is a long game. Education is the key. Some of that education might happen in ways you would fully expect, but still need to do. Things like small groups, Bible studies, book studies, curriculum that's out there. There's video series you can watch. If you are looking for those resources and don't know where to look, talk to me. Our website, the Covenant Network of Presbyterians website, has a lot of resources, and there's hundreds more that aren't there, but I can try to help you connect with. That small group work is really important. I think large group work is also very important, and I think it sometimes gets overlooked. I think when we have hard topics, we think that we need to break the congregation down into bite-sized chunks and work on them a few at a time, and that is part of a good strategy. But I also think there need to be places where the whole community comes together and hears one another's voice, sees one another's reactions. I don't necessarily mean you should structure like debates or town halls where everybody just says whatever they want in a free-form way. That may or may not be helpful. You and your congregation know each other, and you may have to think about what is most helpful there. But just allowing people to say things, especially if they're not well-informed or are hurtful, in the presence of LGBTQIA+ people or family members of queer people, might actually be counterproductive. You might actually do some damage. So don't just throw things open and let everyone say whatever they want. But I also wouldn't try to protect the congregation from discomfort. Sometimes it really is important to put something out there and see that beloved church members are pushing back or raising questions. You need to know what you're dealing with. And how people respond when they're together might be different than how they respond privately. Their silence might not tell you what you think it does. Whatever you put together, though, I want to encourage you to do something we tried to do this morning, which is to lift up the stories of LGBTQIA+ people, lift up the experiences of those who are most affected by the church's pattern of exclusion. The risk of an educational effort is that it might reduce what we're talking about to a set of issues, when what we're actually talking about are children of God, people. Don't let people get away with thinking that we can reduce this to a careful study of chapter 3 of Colossians. This is about the whole witness of Christians to a portion of our community and to a portion of humanity. Whenever you can center the voices and experiences of LGBTQIA+ people, even in your planning, do that. And if you're in a congregation where you don't have any openly queer people, which is a lot of our congregations, find some to talk with. It's hard sometimes, but work at it. Because only then are we really engaging, and only then are hearts and minds actually being opened, because it affects them. They see it, it touches them. It's about real people. That's the first step, the preparation. When you've done a lot of that education, you might be ready to go on to the next step, which is discernment and decision. Now, I don't want to say that you will ever reach a point where you've educated yourselves all you need to and you don't have to do that anymore. This is a fluid process. You're going to keep moving back and forth between education and discernment and decision. Because there comes a point where you're going to have to make a decision about this. You're going to have to decide something. Now, what exactly you decide might be different depending on your church. For a lot of churches, the point of discernment is joining the covenant network of Presbyterians or joining the more light Presbyterians. For some, it is a declaration of their own doing, some sort of statement that the session makes that says, we are an open and affirming church where everyone is welcome, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. It may be different for you than for others, but don't think that not saying something or looking around the room and people just saying, okay, I think we're good, is a decision. And the decision that you need to make, I believe, in a Presbyterian church, is a decision of the session. Not the pastor alone, not the whole congregation necessarily, but it's the session. Why would I say that? Anyone? Why would that be a session decision? Yeah, that's what sessions do. They define the mission and ministry of the congregation. I have talked to more than one church, more than 5 churches, many churches, who say, well, the session supports this, but they think we need a vote of the congregation. Baloney. We don't do that with the church budget. We don't do that with whether we're going to support a particular mission coworker. We don't do that with anything except the pastor we call. The session are the leaders of the church. You heard Alex's story. Here's a congregation of 400 people that the majority would not have voted to be affirming. But I don't think anyone would argue that the faith community of 150 people that emerged out of that is passionately, fervently doing gospel work because faithful discernment by leaders who were called to make hard choices made a hard choice. And that isn't the work of the whole congregation, not in a Presbyterian system. That's what we ask our leaders to do. Now, someone asked in the first workshop, does that mean that we have to make sure that the session is part of the education that we did in the first step? And I think the answer is yes. Not only should they be part of it because they need to learn, but they should be part of it because they need to see where it's landing and what the challenges are and what questions need to be answered. The session isn't making the decision apart from the congregation. They're just claiming their authority and responsibility. I do think that these two processes are integrally intertwined between education and discernment. You will learn through the education process what you need to know to discern timing and to discern well who you are. Now, once you've decided something, you have created a platform from which action can emerge. And action, practical actions, are the thing that I want to talk about next. But I'm going to pause. Any questions or conversation from where we are so far? Yeah. Yeah.
Really is making a lot of effort in a number of areas for the people that we see in need. One of them being homeless. And there's a real money issue and volunteer raising. And I don't know
So Paul is asking, if I'm summarizing correctly, the church is trying to do outreach in a lot of different ways. Homelessness is one of the real problems in the community that you want to address, and I'm sure there are a dozen others. Paul asked, where's the outside support, financial support for something like this? And I think implied in your question, if I may, is, how do we choose what to prioritize when there's limited resources? I think that's a fair question. I think that's always the question that sessions and churches have to ask. And I would ask that question. I think I might frame it just a little bit differently. And first, I think we might overstate just how scarce our resources are. I find that when churches look at the array of possible mission activities through a lens of scarcity, they find themselves to have very little they can do. But when they start looking at the range of needs in their community through the lens of abundance, when they start with looking at how much we do have, they don't find that they're running out. What they find is that they keep finding new ways to do the mission and ministry that they feel called to do in a particular moment. It doesn't mean money is unlimited. And so another point I guess I'd have is that a lot of what I'm talking about, at least today, in terms of being a more inclusive and welcoming church, does not cost that much money, if any. And some would say that if we are building stronger churches and more vibrant faith communities, we might actually have fewer problems on the resources side, although I don't want to lift this up as a way to make money. But I do think, I don't think the limitation of financial resources is what's really stopping most churches from being more inclusive. How do we prioritize mission activities? One of the questions I would always ask is, who are we leaving behind by not doing something? And time and again, we have made choices in the church based on who we might alienate or make uncomfortable from our own ranks. And this comes up a lot, and Alex alluded to this as well. I mean, every church, in fact, there's a fear, and I say this as a progressive, gay pastor of a church for 13 years. I worried about this. You have to think about your long-standing members in the pews who are going to be hurt or offended or nervous about a step you might take. And not only are you worried about their contributions, it's not even as cynical as that. You care about them and you love them and you know they know the church. But here's the thing. The people who are uncomfortable when we reach out to LGBTQIA plus people are usually folks who have been comfortable for a long time. And they don't want to change their level of comfort. But the people we're leaving out if we don't reach out to the LGBTQ community are people who have been uncomfortable for a long time. They have been marginalized, they have been wounded, they've been systematically excluded or personally attacked. And when we say we're making a choice about who we're leaving behind or who we're not serving with a particular action, I guess I'd ask you where in Christian discipleship you think we should fall. Should we choose again the comfortable, the ones who've always won before, the ones who are going to be okay, or the ones who have been hurt before again and again? Who should we be reaching out to? Where would Jesus be standing? So I don't really accept the idea that we have to pit homelessness against queerness. Although, by the way, very substantial portion of the homeless community, especially youth and young adults, are gay or lesbian or transgender. That is very common. Also, concerned about mental health, concerned about suicide prevention. Huge disproportionate percentage of those who consider suicide or commit suicide, especially young people, LGBTQ. So a lot of other things in the church that we might choose to prioritize in mission, if we're paying attention, we're going to care about queer inclusion as well. So let's move to actions. Here's 3 areas of where I think we can have substantial impact with our actions. And this section of what I'm sharing is more kind of a laundry list, but what I hope is it's not seen as a comprehensive list. It's more to trigger and spur your own thinking and applying it to your communities. 3 general categories of action. The first are words and acts of hospitality. And honestly, if you take nothing else from today's workshop from me, you should remember everything Alex says. But if you remember just one thing I say, it's that we can be hospitable in the church. And if we were truly hospitable, we would be 100 times ahead of where we are now toward LGBTQ people. Nobody's opposed to hospitality. There's no anti-hospitality faction in your church, I promise. But sometimes the things we do in practice don't show the church's hospitality that we all believe we are called to show. So let's talk about something like worship and the language we use in worship. We, in our language, could send a message that says something about God or about people that does not actually encompass or embrace all of our congregation or all of our potential congregation. We could use language that is exclusive or language that is expansive. If we use language for God that is masculine all the time, if it's always God, He, God the Father, God, He, you are sending a message. Whether you intend to or not, whether this is what you say or not, the kids growing up in your church and the adults growing in faith in your church are learning that there's something about God that's masculine, not feminine, not transgender, not non-binary, when in fact what we believe is that God is embracing, encompassing of all of those. The language we use matters, and it's a matter of hospitality. It's a matter of putting ourselves in the shoes of another. It's a matter of looking and hearing through other people's eyes and ears and being intentional about believing that what we do for them matters, that doing it for someone because that is what they want and need is enough. The same is true for words we use and how we address people, the name they have chosen. I'm thinking specifically here of transgender folks or non-binary folks who have undergone their own discernment and who identify in a way differently than they had been identified at birth or with a name different than the name they were given. We say, it's so inconvenient to have to learn someone's new name. And I would say, your pain in having to address someone by a different name does not compare with the pain they have experienced with gender dysphoria, with not feeling at one with their bodies or with the way people see them and call them. I would offer that pronouns, people who ask, for example, to use they, them pronouns. I seem to have an undue number of English teachers in my religious life who really have a problem with using a plural pronoun for a singular person. It is hard, and especially it's hard, I will just confess, if you've known the person previously. It is hard. There is a person in my life who is very dear to me, who I have misgendered dozens of times because I knew them when they were identifying differently. But it's what they want and it's what they need. It's who they are. And hospitality demands that we do things that are hard. And if we fail to do the hard thing for someone, we say we're sorry and we move on and we try to do it right the next time. That is what we would do if someone broke their leg in front of our house and needed someone to help them into the vehicle that was going to get them care. That is what we would do if our neighbor's oven broke on Thanksgiving Day and they needed to cook their turkey in our kitchen for a couple of hours. We wouldn't think twice about it. It's what we do. And I have to say, I'm astonished at the Christians who for some reason would not treat another with hospitality around these issues sometimes. It's crucially important, and I think it's just basic Christian faith. When we think about it that way, I think it can get a lot less complicated. And sometimes that's what we need to say. Someone in another workshop raised, but what about the grandmothers? What about the folks who just aren't used to this? And I say, well, don't mess with the grandmothers. I learned everything I know about hospitality from my grandmother. People who have spent their life, grandparents of any gender, caring for people, loving people, compassionate toward people, they know that it really doesn't matter what that person's doing in their personal life or what other things are going on. Love and compassion is always our default. And that's what we do in the church too. The other act of hospitality I think a church can show in today's world involves church facilities and any facilities that might be exclusive of people. Certainly we came to this realization some years ago around people with disabilities. We recognized that even though the law, for some reason, exempts churches from the Americans with Disabilities Act, we are in fact intentional most of the time, especially when we're building new churches, and sometimes when we're renovating old ones, to create accessibility. Because that's what hospitality requires, whether the law requires it or not. We've had a harder time, I think, moving to being inclusive with things like restrooms, of people who may not identify with the male or female gender. Or, for that matter, people who are transgender, who do identify with a gender, but whose gender expression, whose presentation may differ from what people expect. And we need to think about this as a church. So on a practical basis, a thing that churches can do is ensure that there are, within the church, some facilities that are encompassing of all genders, or which are gender neutral. If you have any bathrooms in your whole church that are one stall, a door with a toilet, you have an all-gender bathroom. If you have a sign on that door that says men or women, take it off. There's no reason that bathroom can't be used by people of both gender, of any gender, or no gender. There's other creative solutions. I'm glad to talk more about those too. But every church can think creatively about these issues. A lot of businesses are coming to the place where they're saying, that bathroom is full of stalls anyway. Why do men and women have to use different restrooms? Why can't that just be an all-gender restroom? Put some plants in the urinals, and then you've got stalls. It's worth thinking about. Those are acts of hospitality. Second, I want to talk about acts of visibility. Things you can do to be seen. Being seen matters. It matters to the people who are LGBTQ because they see that they are affirmed by what you as a church are doing. It also matters to say to the whole world, this is who we are as a church. So acts of visibility at a church might include things like outward signs or symbols that say we're a gay-affirming or LGBT-affirming church. What would you consider an example of such a symbol? Oh, there's one, yes. The Pride flag, or the Pride Progress flag, which is what that particular one is called, is a great example of one that says to an LGBTQ person, that might be a church that would welcome me. An example of a banner that is not necessarily that, I do want us to hear clearly, is the banner that says, all are welcome. That's not a bad sentiment. The church I served as a pastor had that banner. But an LGBTQIA+ person does not think that applies to them. We've been wounded before. We've heard that. That's an all as long as you are what we expect you to be or want you to be. And even if that isn't true of your church, even if you genuinely would welcome them, that banner does not tell them that. You have to mention it. So whether it's a pride flag or a little tiny rainbow on your website or language about sexual orientation and gender identity in your mission statement, something has to be intentional or it won't be received. Another way that you can be visible is to participate in community events or to host community organizations that align you outside of your comfort zone with the broader LGBTQIA+ community. So examples would be things like pride festivals, hosting a P-flag group or some other group. I know a church that hosts both the gay men's chorus and the lesbian women's chorus in their church, which are separate organizations. There's different ways you can be visible in your welcome, but finding those ways, I think, does send the message over beyond just a generic message of welcome. The other act of visibility that I think is really important is to have the daily life of your church reflect the full diversity of God's people. Which is to say, when you're thinking about who's going to read scripture in church, if you have LGBTQIA+ folks, they need to be among them. When you have Advent candle, speaking of Advent candles, when you have Advent candle lightings, is the family lighting the Advent candle each week always a mother, a father, and 2 children? Or does it include some single people and some same-sex couples? Or 2 older people who are friends? How are we visibly sending messages about who we are and what we think is good and authentic and part of our community? So we talked about hospitality, we talked about visibility. I will wrap up with one other category, which is acts of publicity. Visibility, I think, is less about PR and more about daily expressions of your ministry priority of being inclusive and affirming. But publicity, I am talking about PR. I'm thinking about the intentional choices you make to send the message out in the world that this is who we are. Now, the most important of these mediums in today's world, if the goal is to attract people to your church, and that should not be our only goal. I'm not only worried about your church attracting people, by the way. I'm mostly concerned about you doing the right thing. But if your goal is to attract people to your church, what's the number one thing you need to be giving attention to? Yes, your digital presence. Your website, probably most especially, although your social media is something they will definitely check out as well if you have it. Your website is what they're going to Google, they're going to search for you, and they're going to read every page of it to figure out who you are. Well, that's not true. They're going to read every page of it unless you alienate them on the first page. But if you intrigue them, they're going to keep reading. I would encourage you to put on your first page, your home page, something, again, remember, we're talking about doing all this after you've done the discernment. Don't put it there if it's not true. But if it's true, put it on your home page. They need to know that this is who you are. I would encourage you to spend some time, look at your website as though through a newcomer's eyes. And if you need a little palate cleanser to be able to do that authentically, go look at some other churches' websites first. Google 5 other churches named First Presbyterian Church that are not yours. And just see what you think they say about themselves. Imagine if you were a queer person. Would you feel welcome in that church based on what you see there? And then look at yours and see if it's doing what it needs to do. I would say the same thing about walking through the front door of your church. What do you see? How many brochures into the brochure rack do you have to go to find something that would indicate welcome of LGBTQ people? Would anybody greet them at the door that would send them the message that they are welcome and not alone. And finally, think about where you advertise and where you speak out. Churches don't do much newspaper advertising anymore. That's probably best. Your website is way more important. But if there are options in your community, is there an LGBTQ newspaper or magazine? Is there a bulletin board or event where people have the opportunity to sponsor something or put in an ad? Your presence there might just be exactly the message that someone needs to say, this is a place I would be welcome. I'm going to turn it over to Alex to wrap up a little bit here, and we can take some questions, but what I want us to leave thinking about is what the next steps might be in your particular context. Where are you in this journey, and where do you go from here? Alex?
Thanks, Brian. Wasn't that very helpful? I wish I would have had a Brian back in the day. We had to figure a lot of things out kind of by ourselves. But a lot of what he said, it's interesting because even though we didn't know exactly what we were doing, but we were discerning a lot of those things together when we were making those transitions. And we understood the importance of education and how to really, educate our congregation into what being inclusive really looks like. It's not just, hey, we're going to, welcome people into our service. That was very, very superficial. And that's what most congregations tend to do because they like to see people come in their doors. But, it's beyond that. Are we truly being inclusive? But I want to leave these last 5 minutes to questions. If anyone has questions for Brian, myself, any questions or comments, something, I don't know what journey you all are in right now or how it's looking for you at the moment, or if there's questions. Yes, Kathy. You want to answer that?
Sure. So I think folks who are not Presbyterian in particular do not know what either of those terms mean, and I wouldn't be overly worried about what label particularly you're going to use just on the basis of attracting sort of random LGBTQ people off the street. However, I will say that Presbyterians and gay-affirming people, even some who aren't Presbyterian, but who move to a new community looking for a church, are going to research churches to see whether they are part of the whether they bear those labels, whether they are part of the organizations that have historically been supportive of inclusion. And so, if you go to the Covenant Network website, there's a Find a Church button, and you zero right in and you see which churches have said they are. More Light has a similar function on their website. By the way, churches can be members of both organizations, and many are. The one thing I would say though is that people, Covenant Network has never tried to suggest that we've never advertised to the national LGBT community. We've always been more focused on the church, and so we try to be a resource to you. I think the most important element is taking that step and the things that you're going to do because you've taken that step, not just that you can check it off, now we're a Covenant Network church. So it matters, but it isn't, if it's the only thing a church did, it would not be nearly enough. Does that answer your question? The Covenant Network, by the way, to join, what a session has to do is affirm our mission statement. It's on our website called the Call to Covenant Community. That's all that's required. You become a member. We'll put you on the website. We'll probably want to celebrate you on Facebook, but what we hope, that's only the first step. And we have churches that are actively engaged and sending financial contributions and come to conferences, and then we have churches that haven't done either of those things in many years, but are still working in their own inclusion, on inclusion in their own communities. So.
We have time. One of the things that I just go back and forth with and can struggle with sometimes, just so they can hear me online. Hello, online folks. One of the things that I would just be curious to hear your guys' thoughts of how do you know when you are ready to move to that next level? Like from the discernment education piece into the publicity or the visibility and all of those things. Like, and I know there's not going to be like an easy checklist of like a magical way of knowing, but I really understand and respect the need to do this in a way that is authentic, and so you're actually inviting people into a place that is inclusive. But for many of us, we're not going to get 100% of everybody. So can you move forward without 100% of everybody? And what does that look like? How do you, because as a pastor, I want them to stay in the church and to watch this happen, and hopefully hearts and minds are changed over time, but I also don't want to not move forward until, so just how do you know you're ready, and how do you care for maybe, and when you still are not all 100% of one mind?
I wasn't even thinking about it. I was like, this is going straight to Brian.
You don't have 100%, do you?
No. But I think you had mentioned it earlier, like for Presbyterians, it's the session, the leadership. I think that for us, it was more seeing how our leaders were going to respond to this. You know, are they on board or not? Because I really do feel that if you have your leaders, it's a way better way to influence the rest of the congregation, and they feel a little bit more confident about the next steps that need to be taken, because it's not, just one person that's like pastor deciding for everybody. It's a group of people that have been trusted with this responsibility. I mean, that's the way we moved forward. We never just did it on our own just like that. But of course, with the Presbyterian. With the sessions, you can't do that. Sorry. With the sessions, you can't do that. But that's the beauty of it, is because you get more buy-in with that. And when you have the buy-in, I think that those transitions can be made. And there's, sadly, not everybody's on board, meaning of the congregation. But I think knowing you have your leadership, it's going to be able to help you to be able to make those next steps. I mean, that's my take on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. I think the reality is that we probably are never 100% about anything, but we have this very Presbyterian idea that you can actively concur, you can passively submit, that is, or you can peaceably withdraw. Passively submit is not a bad thing. It doesn't have to mean that you are sacrificing your conscience. It doesn't mean that you are somehow being untrue to yourself or to God. It just means that you aren't in the majority, and that's okay. Now, I will make a distinction between people who stay in the church that has chosen to be affirming and are not themselves affirming. There's a difference between still having their own moral and ethical concerns about, say, homosexuality, and actively demonstrating their disapproval to the people who come to your church for safety and community. And there may be people who need to move from passive submission to peaceable withdrawal if they can't live with people who are different than themselves. I will say LGBTQ people have been doing that forever in the church, and are still doing it. And they are, and even in your church, Ashley, even in the most affirming churches, where there are people who are openly queer, even there, those queer people are making a sacrifice every time they come to church, knowing that there are people in those pews who don't really approve of them or don't get them or don't want to be around them. That happens in all but a very few Presbyterian churches. And so the level of sympathy I have for the person on the other end of that spectrum, who is still the majority, who is still one of 95% straight people and 98% cisgender people, and who is a little bit uncomfortable because there is 1% that is different from them and is being affirmed, you can only do so much about that. Does that, I mean, I don't mean that I don't care about them, and I sure don't mean that God doesn't love them. But their choice to withdraw themselves from authentic community because of their discomfort is not parallel to an LGBTQ person who feels they must not be part of the community because of the rejection and pain that they are shown, that they are caused when they go there. So that those two are not having the same experience. And when we say, well, okay, but if the response, this is my church too, to the person who is not comfortable with LGBTQ people, well, you're having a different kind of exclusion than the one who we are systematically excluding. It is not the same. You're choosing that for yourself. Questions? I think we're at the time. One more question.
Yeah, he was saying that is there a spillover when you're being accepting of homeless people, people of color? Does that also spill over to LGBTQIA? Or vice versa, that's right. Well, it was interesting because before you even asked that question, I was thinking about something about your question, so kind of would go for both. One of the things that I believe prepared our congregation years ago was the pulpit. When I began to preach about what we call liberation, where we are focusing and centering the voices of the marginalized and the oppressed, that Jesus, he did have a preference. Jesus did, he loved everybody, but he had a preference, and his preference was always those that were being marginalized and oppressed. And so I think one of the things that helps us out when we look at what you're saying, we have to always be asking ourselves the question, who are those that are being oppressed? Who are those that are being marginalized, rejected, not being loved or accepted? And and that includes people of color, that includes homeless people and LGBTQIA. And this is the gospel message. And I think that when we begin to help people understand what the gospel really means, that's where the love will be birthed toward those that are being marginalized. At the very least, the awareness is going to be there, because you're continuing to hear, these are the people that Jesus came for. When he came, he was with them. He came from them. He was with them. He loved them, healed them, stood for them, advocated for them, and defended them. And I think that that's very helpful when you start going into these discussions, because then people will be able to have a point of reference when it comes to the gospel. It's like, are you going to believe the gospel or not? Because this is what the gospel is all about. So I don't know if that answered the question, but yeah.
Thanks, everyone. This is a great conversation. I know it's just the start of a conversation, but I hope that we can continue it in the next half hour on your own, and then in weeks and months to come. So thanks. Thanks, Alex. Pleasure. And so we'll start again with our closing worship and reflection time in this room at 3:15. I know you'll be tempted to leave because it's been a long day, but don't. It'll be great.